What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So this morning, Elliot Friedman decided to drop an absolute bomb on us when it comes to the New York Rangers. As he tweeted out, in the aftermath of their 6-2 loss in Edmonton, the Rangers have made it clear that they are interested in making moves and shaking up their roster. Among the names indicated are Chris Kreider, which is pretty shocking, as well as Jacob Trouba, who is already kind of on the trade block this offseason, along with other options will be considered. So yeah, I decided to ask you guys on my Instagram to send me your Kreider and Trouba hypotheticals. So there's going to be a lot more Kreider hypotheticals, considering the fact that he only makes $6.5 million and last year had 39 goals and 36 assists for 75 points. He can at least be still viewed as a positive asset, while Jacob Trouba, they probably have to be some type of money retention or the New York Rangers attaching picks to Jacob Trouba. So we're going to go through that right now. On my podcast, it's going to come out tomorrow or Wednesday. I'll go more in depth on whether or not I think this is a good plan for the New York Rangers to potentially be making changes despite them being in a playoff position. So I'll get into it then. We're just going to be reacting to your hypotheticals. You guys sent it in to my Instagram, MB on hockey. Feel free to go follow it, and hopefully you could also send stuff in to be featured in these videos. But let's not waste any time. Let's get into it. And up first, we have this from Al AU14. Kreider for Claude Giroux. When looking at this, Claude Giroux has 1 year left at $6.5 million. Kreider has another 2 years left at this at 6.5, or 2 years left on his deal at 6.5 after the season. So the money works. Now, I'm going to have to take some liberties with these modified no trade clauses because there's a potential that Kreider obviously would not want to go to Ottawa. But just when looking at this, I think it does make some sense. I think Ottawa might have to attach a pick or a prospect to this just because Kreider is 3 years younger and is under contract the next 2 seasons. While Claude Giroux, I'm not saying if he got traded to the New York Rangers, he'd immediately walk the following season. But I think it could make sense. In terms of this season, they're very comparable players. They're older wings, solid, pretty solid both ways. I know that Kreider isn't really having that good of a season, but they are about the same caliber of player. So I think that this would be a pretty decent trade for both teams. I think that that's kind of a win-win in terms of shaking it up. And I think Kreider definitely has a higher ceiling than maybe a Claude Giroux 40-goal ceiling, obviously. So yeah, I actually think that's a solid deal for both teams. Next up, we got this from Mauer Hedgick. They say Trouba to the Red Wings for 50% retained for Hall in a 3rd round pick. I think when looking at this, it would have to be only retaining like $3 to $2.5 million. So Trouba's only at a $5 to $5.5 million cap it for the Red Wings. 50% wouldn't really make a lot of sense in this case, considering the fact Hall is making $3.4 million. If you're Chris Drury, that would basically be saying that Trouba is only a $600,000 better defender than Justin Hall, and I still think Trouba is a decent amount better than Justin Hall. So I don't really love that in terms of the retention. But if the retention was more so a $1.5 to $2 million the New York Rangers are saving this season and next season, I think it could make some sense just to get Trouba out of there, kind of get him out as the captain, and he is a massive liability come playoff time. Just if Justin Hall isn't some beast, but he does have some playoff experience, not the worst trade, especially considering Trouba might be willing to go to Detroit. I know this offseason he wasn't. There was something with his wife finishing up her medical residency in New York. He didn't want to leave quite yet, but I think potentially mid-season he'd be willing to do it, or maybe this offseason once she finishes that, especially because Trouba's from the Detroit area. So yeah, I think that also could make a decent amount of sense. We're starting off pretty strong. Louis says Kreider for Brock Nelson trade up. This is obviously never going to happen. I personally probably wouldn't do this if I was a New York Islanders fan. I do think Brock Nelson is better than Chris Kreider, but it definitely, if we weren't dealing with the New York Rangers and the New York Islanders, I think this actually would be a pretty solid deal for both teams. Brock Nelson this is his final year at $6 million. Next up, an absolute blockbuster. Trouba Gabe Perreault in a 1st round pick for Rasmus Anderson and Andrei Kuzmenko. My God. Now, when looking at this, when breaking this down, just to dump Jacob Trouba right now probably would cost you a 1st round pick, or definitely like 2 2nd-round picks. So basically it's like Gabe Perreault and Rasmus Anderson for Andrei Kuzmenko. If you were a Calgary Flames with Kuzmenko, let's just take Kuzmenko out of it. Honestly, he makes $5.5 million. Just get him out of that deal, even if he's half retained. Rasmus Anderson for Trouba, a 1st round pick, and Gabe Perreault. Would you do that if you were a Flames fan? Would you do that if you were a Rangers fan? If you're a Flames fan, I think I would do it. I think I would just swallow Trouba's cap hit the next 2 seasons. You're probably, although they are highly competitive right now, they are in a playoff spot. They're top 4 in the Western Conference. I think we can agree they're probably not winning anything this season as well as next season. So I think I would do that just in terms of utilizing my cap space by getting a guy like Jacob Trouba, a first-round pick that could be 23rd overall, and Gabe Perreault to get rid of Rasmus Anderson. That seems about fair. If you're a Rangers fan, do you give up a first-round pick in Gabe Perreault? You're maybe a little bit less likely, but I think from the Flames' perspective, it's something that I definitely would do. This comes from Teddy Dunn. Kreider to Vegas for Pietrangelo and 25% retained. 25% would get the cap hits about relatively equal. I believe Pietrangelo is at like $8.7, $8.8 million. This is very, very interesting. I think that this, in my opinion, is probably the biggest win-win, because when looking at Vegas, they'd still have Shea Theodore, they'd still have Noah Hannafin. Yes, their defense core would take a hit, but I think it still would be fine. And although their forward core has actually been pretty good, I talked about it in a prior video, adding a guy like Chris Kreider to that, who's still only 33 years old, has 2 more years after this, again at $6.5 million. I think that this would be a pretty sizable win. And obviously, if you're the New York Rangers, I think you would do this, considering the fact that you'd probably want to move off Trouba, and then Pietrangelo immediately, even with, well, Trouba would move down to the third right-hand defenseman, obviously. And then you'd have a guy, an experienced winner like Alex Pietrangelo as your second right D. And also you have young forwards that could fill the gap for Chris Kreider. So I actually think this is a pretty great deal for both teams, if I'm not going to lie. I think New York might honestly win it even a little bit more than Vegas. Next up from Mathis Vazzi, Kreider to Nashville for Nyquist Carrier in a 2025 first round pick. I think you could probably bump that down to a second round pick. I think if that's a first round pick, if I'm New York, I'm probably doing that. Gustav Nyquist only making like $3.1 million this season. You can probably get him on a very team friendly deal. He had 75 points last year. And if you're the New York Rangers, do you think Gustav Nyquist at half the salary cap hit could be good? Alexander Carrier is a pretty solid, reliable defenseman, and you're also picking up an asset. Another very solid deal for both teams, in my opinion. We got Liam McKay, Kreider for Vetrano, in a third-round pick. I can see the vision here for the New York Rangers. Obviously, Vetrano is like half the price as Kreider. I don't really get it for Anaheim that much, taking on another pretty old player, although he would be positive value. What's really the point of Kreider for the next 2 seasons? Anaheim's pretty far away. I think they'd just be better off trading Vetrano for assets, but I think it does make sense for the New York Rangers, at least. This one's a little bit of a funny one. Kreider to the Devils for a 2025 first, one of their seconds this season. And Palat, this could maybe, no, this couldn't really work even if they were different teams, considering the fact the Rangers are still trying to win now. Palat is such a negative asset, even with that first and second attached to it. I don't think New York bites at this, even though they could potentially flip those picks. Palat is just such a bad deal. I don't know about that. Another Ottawa one. Sal says this won't happen, but Kreider, Zach Jones, and Ottman for Brady Tkachuk. If you turn this into Gabe Perreault, there's an argument. There's an argument Ottawa accepts this. If not, I don't really rate Ottman or Zach Jones really that high, so it really just comes down to Kreider versus Tkachuk. They're kind of the same player. Tkachuk's obviously a little bit more physical, but Tkachuk makes like only $8.2 million, is a far better player than Chris Kreider at this point. It is like 8 years younger. So I think you'd have to attach Perreault. If you add, again, a top 20 prospect in hockey, maybe Ottawa bites, but again, it's not like Kreider's young by any stretch. If they're trading Brady Tkachuk, they're probably getting even younger. They're probably adding a first and maybe an elite prospect, but I don't hate that deal if it is Gabe Perreault instead of Ottman. Kreider for Stamkos. Why the hell not? I don't know. Like, when looking at it, I think I'd be more willing to do that if I was Nashville, just because you're saving $1.5 million and you're getting a guy 3 years younger. If Drury's set on just some type of change, getting a veteran guy that captained 2 teams to a Stanley Cup could make sense, but I think that Nashville would definitely be getting the better of that deal, considering the cap hits and considering the age. We got another Calgary one. Levi says, Kadri for Kreider. This is a pretty interesting one. Again, in this scenario, Kreider would waive his no movement clause. But yeah, when looking at this, if Kadri was like 1 or 2 years younger or had 1 or 2 years left on his contract, I could get behind it. I think they are about the same caliber of player, but considering that Kadri has 4 more years after this on his contract at $7 million versus Kreider another 2 years at 6.5. Kadri's also a year older at 34 compared to Kreider at 33. If I was New York, I'd stay away from that. I'd definitely stay away from that. Maybe if Calgary attached a pick, I could be down, but I'd probably just stay away. Next up, we got an in Division 1 from Sasha. They say Trouba in a second to Columbus for Provorov. This would definitely have to be a first-round pick. Probably even more. It might have to be a first and a second in Trouba because, again, just to dump Trouba at fully $8 million. If you're retaining some money, maybe it won't cost that much, but if it's fully Trouba's $8 million, it'd be a first and a second, probably. Not going to lie, considering that, because Provorov is an expiring guy that has value. Provorov's probably going to get traded for a first-round pick. Granted, he get traded for a first-round pick if he got half retained. But yeah, I think Trouba, a first and a third for Provorov could potentially make some sense, but that might not even be enough. They might want some type of young player, but I get what you're saying here in terms of Columbus weaponizing their cap space to maybe potentially take on more assets, but definitely Trouba in a second-round pick is not going to get it done for arguably the best defenseman this year at the deadline. Jason says Kreider for Hartman. I always botch this guy's name, but he's the Russian that just came over that's still pretty young. A 2025 second and a 2026 second. New York would be saving some cap space on this as well as garnering some picks that they could potentially flip. I don't hate that. If their scouting department really likes that Russian player, I'm just going to completely botch it. But if they think that he eventually can be a middle six forward, maybe Ryan Hartman, nothing special, but a very good middle sixer at a pretty reasonable cap hit, and you could flip those second round picks for something. I don't love that for New York, but it wouldn't be the worst trade ever if that makes sense in a way. I don't know, but it gets like a meh for me. And then lastly, Utah, Michelli, a 2025 second, a 2025 third. For Kreider, I kind of like this for both teams in a way. When looking at Utah, they made some aggressive moves in terms of their defense core last offseason. Their forward core maybe is still lacking in terms of some two-way physical play, veteran play, that Kreider could definitely fit the bill when looking at that. New York would still be getting a young guy in Michelli that has a bunch of potential that would be able to impact day one, but Utah kind of has given up a little bit on Michelli, considering the fact that he's playing way less minutes than in years past, but I still think he has potential as a middle six, little small playmaker winger. So I don't hate that, especially with the picks on top of it. New York saves like $3 or $4 million Michelli to Kreider, as well as having some more picks to potentially weaponize with that open cap space to go out and make a different move. And obviously Michelli's 24 to Kreider's 33. Not the worst deal ever. But let me know in the comments, what do you think about these trades? Which one was your favorite? I think that Vegas one is just really interesting. I would love to see. Vegas would do some like savage shit like that. They brought in Pietrangelo, wins a cup, then see you later. We're going to go get Chris Kreider. But let me know in the comments what you think about it. I'll be seeing you in the next one.